The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate that chastity as a virtue has features which make it more than the restraining or moderation of our sexual desires. I begin by focusing on the primary meaning of chastity as the practice of pre-marital abstinence and marital fidelity, and then attempt to draw out a few other meanings, highlighting the notion that chastity, like all virtues, is a constituent of the common good of civil society. I conclude with a few thoughts on the role of chastity for caring and authentic encounters, so necessary for being fully human and human welfare. I present my thoughts to a general adult audience and will not point out the implications for leadership at every juncture, but leave it to the listener to make his or her own connections. It is well known that a list of the sometimes called 7 heavenly virtues was proposed by a Christian governor named Aurelius Clemens Prudentius, 410 AD, in his poem Psychomachia, or Battle or Contest of the Soul. This poem proposed 7 good and contrary virtues to directly counteract the said 7 deadly sins or vices. The virtues were chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. Chastity is sometimes rendered in English translations as modesty. This poem became very popular in the Middle Ages and helped to spread the concept of holy virtue throughout Europe. Practicing these virtues is considered to protect one against the temptation from the 7 deadly sins, with each one having its own counterpart. Each of the 7 heavenly virtues matches a corresponding sin. Lust and chastity are the counterparts of each other. Lust as an expression of sexual immorality is the counterpart of chastity, synonymous with sexual purity. To be virtuous, chastity requires the moderation of sexual desires. In this view, those who are chaste are morally clean or pure in their thoughts, words, and actions. Chastity means not having any sexual relations before marriage. It also means complete fidelity between husband and wife during marriage. In the Western world, the term chastity has become closely associated and is often used interchangeably with sexual abstinence, especially before marriage. In the context of marriage, husband and wife commit to a lifelong relationship which excludes the possibility of sexual intimacy with other persons. Chastity therefore requires marital fidelity. Chastity also includes cleanliness through cultivated good health and hygiene, maintained amongst others by refraining from intoxicants. Also, to be honest with oneself, one's family, one's friends, and to people in general. Chastity reaches as far as the embracing of moral wholesomeness and achieving purity of thought through education and betterment toward a life worth living. The practice of this virtue strengthens our ability to refrain from being distracted and influenced by hostility, temptation, or corruption. Chastity then is regarded as fundamental to the practice of the Christian life because it involves an apprenticeship of self-control, which is a key characteristic of chastity, self-control. By attaining mastery over one's passions, reason, will, and desire can harmoniously work together to do what is good. In this sense, then, every virtue is a constituent of the common good of civil society. Arguing for philosophical support for the conviction that marriage and marital fidelity are necessary preservations of society, Patrick Riley's thesis is that chastity should be deemed as a civilizing force in society. Civilizing in the sense that chastity moderates or tempers our sexual drive. Very laudable, some would say. But we live in the 21st century. We are the children of the sexual revolution, which some date in the United States from the 1920s, coming to full blossom during the 1960s. Yes, as a response to earlier puritanical ideas about sex, this revolution inaugurated a renewed attack on marriage and chastity. One of the consequences of the sexual revolution is captured by Solomon Schimmel, who wrote, "A characteristic of lust and our sexually provocative popular culture is to exaggerate the importance of sex in life. To a certain extent, this is a reaction against earlier puritanical attitudes, but to give the impression in advertising and the mass media that happiness depends upon being forever sexually attractive and fulfilled is to propagate a grand lie. Lust falsely asserts that love in the absence of sex is not possible and that sex satisfies in the absence of love." From this followed one conviction that holds many people in its grip. One is not normal unless sexual experiences are freely entered into from early life. The conviction that there are no limits to sex on demand has produced serious psychosocial, spiritual consequences, such as abortion, teen pregnancy, single motherhood, divorce, AIDS, and other sexually transmitted diseases, and even sterility. To counter these consequences of what now has come to be known as sexual addiction in many cases, secular society's advice is just say no or hand teenagers a contraceptive and say to them, be safe. Nevertheless, the childbirth rate, in particular the huge numbers of out-of-wedlock children, are unprecedented in history and for some, like Peter Drucker, can threaten national stability. The emergence of the science of demographics is one response to the social problems associated with population growth and the destruction of families. Also, the need for more and continued natural resources and social infrastructure due to the growing population numbers. These social problems dominate the policies of all developing countries and may, if not responded to, lead to great turbulence in politics. There is no need to labor the painfully obvious, the moral destruction of families. In order to address such issues, a new wave of concern for chastity has emerged. With a rise in the number of teenage pregnancies, abortion, and out-of-wedlock childbirth, many, even governments, have looked with renewed interest to chastity and abstinence as a remedy. As far back as 1998, a Canadian author, Mike Mastromatio, wrote in the National Catholic Register, "The push for chastity education received a tremendous boost in 1996 with congressional passage of a welfare reform bill. Included in the legislation was a Title V provision offering states $50 million over 5 years to promote to teenagers the lesson to abstain from sex until marriage. The legislation was held as a major victory for pro-life and pro-family groups in the United States who have long lamented the negative consequences of the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s. Although the Title V provision does not permit a religious dimension to chastity education, it is seen as a positive alternative to the position of the same-sex cartel that for decades has held a monopoly on sexual education tax funding. Since then, the US federal government has invested more than $1.5 billion in state and federal dollars, with many organizations becoming critical of this effort. One such an organization, Advocates for Youth, who champions efforts to help young people make informed and responsible decisions about their reproductive and sexual health. Advocates believe it can best serve the field by boldly advocating for a positive and realistic approach to adolescent sexual health. In an article entitled "Abstinence Only Until Marriage Programs, Ineffective, Unethical and Poor Health," published in 207, Advocates for Youth, the authors state, The vast majority of Americans support abstinence from sexual activity for school-aged children, especially young adolescents, yet abstinence only until marriage programs currently being taught in many schools are at odds with what most Americans want schools to teach.